Supreme Court has provided some much-needed clarity on non-banking finance companies or NBFCs in its recent ruling. The Apex Court has said that NBFCs are eligible to claim depreciation on vehicles under the finance lease agreement. The inconsistency and the divergent rulings on the treatment of depreciation had severely impacted the business of leasing and its growth potential. Priyal Giuliani Bhattacharya here with the details.
Well, the big question before the Supreme Court was whether a financier or an NBFC can claim depreciation on a vehicle under the lease finance agreement. Now, this question was critical because different high courts, different tribunals had a different view as far as whether they can or cannot claim depreciation. The Supreme Court, however, has held that they can claim depreciation as they pass the test of ownership and usage of the vehicle as per what the depreciation requirements are under the Income Tax Act. What the Supreme Court has said that given that NBFC has the exclusive right and the title of the vehicle and it can repossess the vehicle in case its customer defaults, it therefore is the owner of the vehicle. And to quote Supreme Court, it says as long as the assessee has the right to retain the legal title of the vehicle against the rest of the world, it would be owner of the vehicle in the eyes of the law. As far as the usage test that the Supreme Court really conducted was that in fact these vehicles were used for the business of NBFC as for the business of financing, and if the income of from financing of NBFC's is sort of calculated or looked at as business income, then it would be contradictory not to claim that the vehicles that have been used are not really a part of business, and therefore with those two tests being clear, the Supreme Court has brought in certain level of finality in terms of this question where it says that NBFCs can claim for depreciation. Now remember, this is a very contentious issue and perhaps the topmost in terms of a lot of research that has been done with regard to the lease finance or leasing of business in India. In fact, the ICRA report earlier had also pointed out this as a big contention as far as the leasing business growth is concerned, and therefore this clarity of course becomes as a big relief for NBFCs. However, one has to view that once the DTC comes, would this continue to prevail?
Well, there'll be more uncertainty as the DTC comes, and that's the big question as well. Let's get a legal view coming in from Pranay Bhatia. He's partner at Economic Law Structure. Pranay, you just heard Priyal detailing of the order that has come out, finally going through some clarity. Do you think this is going to give a boost to NBFC and get more clarity into the leasing business in India, which has been going through a lot of miscommunication or sort of no set regulation at this point in terms of ownership?
Certainly, I believe that this decision will help long way. There were a lot of contradictory decisions, and every time the lesser of the asset was concerned whether they would get the depreciation, because it works as a big tax break into the tax liability. So I think that this decision will certainly help NBFCs in predicting their tax costs clearly.
Predicting the tax cost and probably alluding to some of the tax gains that also might come in. But the big question now is not just for NBFCs, Pranay, but given the fact that with this ownership status, which is something that the court has debated back and forth, have ramifications for industry outside NBFCs as well in terms of accounting for depreciation. Do you think this order will stand as a landmark order when the debate of ownership goes on for other leasing as well?
Certainly, it will certainly help whether it is in relation to depreciation or in relation to other assets. What is also prevalent in India is large groups having a central entity which generally takes on all the pool of assets in that one entity and then hires it or leases it out to its group companies based on need. Even those companies will now have a clarity in terms of the fact that when they cross-charge the lease rental to the group companies, the depreciation will be allowable into the hands of the central pooling entity. So this decision is a landmark decision, and it clearly gives direction as to how you need to interpret the term ownership and user in terms of the depreciation which is provided under Section 32 of the Act.
Pranay, a lot of questions that will now be raised is what happens to all those cases that first got thrown out or have already been settled but hadn't reached the Supreme Court. Do you see a lot more litigation now coming back to the Apex Court given the fact that this order has come out and has provided clarity to one of the NBFCs at least right now?
There are two ways to look at it. To the extent that this orders are pending before any appellate authority, be it a Supreme Court or any other high courts, where a similar question with similar fact pattern is involved, the authorities will be now bound to look at their decision in light of this Supreme Court ruling. So, in that sense, there is a clear guidance, and in terms of pending litigation, there is likely to be, you would go to a court and say this is a covered matter. To the extent that, somebody would not have taken it to litigation further for whatever reason, there is also a one more window available under the Income Tax Act, whereby you could go back to the same appellate authority. For example, if a tax tribunal has taken a view that this is not an allowable deduction, a depreciation is not allowable, you could go back to the tribunal and say that in light of this decision, would you like to rectify the mistake in terms of your interpretation of law, because what has been laid down by Supreme Court is the law of the land, and therefore you need to interpret it within the light of this decision. Now, there is timelines which are prescribed. There are 4 years within which you can go back, but yeah, certainly it is one way of looking at things in light of this decision.
But Pranay, there's also one more aspect that one needs to consider. This judgment is out and does provide clarity right now. But there would be more confusion once, if and when the DTC actually comes into play. Because the DTC, if I remember correctly, defines this very differently between the lessor and the lessee. The proposed DTC defines in the lease finance agreement the lessee as the owner and not the lessor, which is in the case of the NBFC, which is quite different from what the Apex Court in this order has said. Do you think till the time the DTC comes in, this would be the landmark order? But then again, with the DTC coming in, sort of things would be reversed around again. Would that not cause a lot more confusion?
There are two ways to look at it. Certainly till the time DTC is out, this remains the law of the land, and unless we see any amendments by the budget session which is coming up round the corner. But keeping that aside, if this is the law as interpreted by Supreme Court, you would continue to claim that NBFCs or the lessors will claim depreciation in respect of the assets which they have leased out. In respect of DTC, we need to also look at the decision again, because here when the Supreme Court came to a conclusion, it did take into consideration that neither the lessor nor the lessee has claimed a depreciation. If you do not allow depreciation claim to the lessor, neither the lessee nor the lessor will be allowed depreciation in respect of a capital expenditure where the asset is used in the business. And therefore, looking at it from that perspective, if DTC comes in and it says that the depreciation is allowable in the hands of lessee, I think there is a clarity in law in terms of who is now eligible for depreciation. And therefore, if you look at it from that perspective, there will be a realignment of lease rental from an NBFC perspective, because they would say, okay, now you are getting the depreciation break and not me, and therefore I would like to look at the lease rent that I should rightly charge, because you're going to get the tax shelter on that. So, that's how, it will balance it out on its own. But as you rightly mentioned, what is most critical is clarity on law. And so long as there is no DTC, the Supreme Court provides the clarity. And once the DTC is out, we presume that, the DTC provisions itself will be clear enough to provide that clarity.
All right, Pranay, thank you for joining us. Clarity finally on the NBFC leasing business.